Oh, okay. Good morning. This is this is working. All right. I tried to do this yesterday and it didn't seem to work. Welcome to the live stream. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different today. Well, new to me. I'm going to be reading from my wife's book, Tales from a Spacious Place. You can see the cover there. Also can see the cover here. And this is a collection of short stories that my wife wrote. Let's see, I think it was a number of years ago now. 2012. It's available on Amazon. And it's a really great book. And it explores some really great ideas about theology, emotional health, relationship with God. And this story is going to be about freedom, obviously, the nature of freedom and how we often, well, we'll just see how the character either understands it or doesn't understand it. So let's just get right into it. I only got a few minutes here before I need to go to work, actually, so let's start the story. Freedom's Paradox by Elizabeth Frerichs from Tales from a Spacious Place. Chapter 1. Actually, let me just... Yeah, that looks like it's supposed to look. Okay. Still new to the live stream. Chapter 1. This is love for God, to obey His commands, and His commands are not burdensome. 1 John 5:3. Impossible. I slammed the phone down and began pacing. Today marked the third day of my fruitless fight to break through bureaucratic red tape. Because it's the law, I mimicked bitterly. I knew the poor woman on the other end of the line was just doing her job, but that didn't make me feel any better. Rules. I threw up my hands in disgust and continued my vigorous pacing. If only all these stupid rules would disappear. The world would be a much better place. I'd be... Sorry, I'm trying to read too fast here. I'd been hemmed in with unwarranted rules my whole life. That's why I became my own boss, for crying out loud, and yet here I was, again, trapped by regulations. There's no way all these rules are really necessary. For the good of the many. More like the inconvenience of most. No wonder so many people cheated the system. Slowing my pace, I slowed my pacing. Could I find a loophole or another way to slide in under the radar? I snorted. Not if that officious cow has anything to say about it, I muttered, then blushed as my mother's strictures came to mind. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. Pretty is as pretty does. My anger slowly drained away, leaving ample room for guilt. Stupid rules. Without rules, guilt would disappear. Although, according to my pastor, God's law was engraved on our consciences, and written laws were only a reflection of His higher law. Maybe I'd always been fighting rules and guilt. I closed my eyes. That woman is a person who's just trying to do her job, and I'd been really testy and downright rude to her. I pushed the guilt away. It wasn't my fault. I was on edge from the hassle of regulations. I needed a break. I checked the clock. Quitting time, or at least dinner time. Monday would be soon enough to take another run at the red tape. I found myself careening down a freeway, about to smash headlong into an enormous concrete barrier, trapped in yet another replay of a recurrent nightmare. I fought to awaken. The dream varied. Sometimes I was driving, sometimes I was the passenger. I always awoke drenched in cold sweat right before impact. In each dream, I fought to change the timeline. If I could prevent the crash or at least figure out what to do differently next time, maybe I could stop having this nightmare. There was the barrier, mere feet away, moving closer and closer, rising up to swallow everything else in view. Sweat poured down my face. Terror, or maybe it was just repetition, etched the scene in my brain. The barrier, larger than life, loomed against a backdrop of barren gray clouds. The smell of hot pavement filled my nostrils. I thought my heart might force its way out of my chest. Help me, I cried aloud, able to speak for once. Time slowed, then stopped. The car froze, inches from the barrier. I looked around. What new horror was my tortured mind about to produce? In the distance, I saw a man walking beside the barrier, coming towards me. I squinted at him, but he was still too far away for a good look. I realized I should at least attempt to escape from my current predicament. With shaking hands, I unbuckled my seatbelt. The door opened, which surprised me. My car dreams always involved problems with the door. I tumbled out of the car and looked around dazedly. Other drivers and vehicles were still frozen, yet the man was walking. I edged closer to my car, then closed my eyes and pinched myself. Despite the pain, I failed to awaken. My eyes flew open. What now? Maybe I could simply avoid him until I woke up. He's walking now, so try not to look suspicious. No need to make him rush. Right. I turned and tried to walk back along the barrier. It didn't matter how quickly I moved. I remained directly beside my car. It reminded me of walking the wrong way on a moving sidewalk. I started to run, certain the man must be someone terrible since I couldn't escape him. It didn't help. He continued to advance, and I remained stuck, running in place by my frozen car. If I couldn't escape, I'd need my strength to fight. I stopped running and began waiting. It seemed to take forever, though it's hard to tell time when time is standing still. As he walked, I studied him. His dark brown hair curled a bit, and he had a swarthy complexion. I watched his demeanor, looking for clues to his character. His stride was confident, but not arrogant. He walked purposely, but not hurriedly. Laugh lines creased his face, although it was currently in repose. He seemed deep in thought. He doesn't really look like a bad guy, but the worst ones never do. Finally, when he was about 10 feet away, he caught my gaze and smiled. I was hooked immediately. His eyes sliced right through my desperate facade of confidence to the heart of my terror. I knew he could tell that I longed to escape. His smile warmed my heart right down to the places cold with dread. It reassured me that he was not coming to do harm. Hello? You said you needed help? He asked, smiling, as though I were a friend he'd run into at the store. I nodded, speechless and off balance. So what do you need? Well, I was about to crash, I managed to squeak out. Oh, really? This is my car, I said, pointing to it. I couldn't even squeeze between it and the barrier. I wondered if the man was blind, dense, or mocking me. I've seen you come here quite a few times lately. You always leave right before impact. At first I was puzzled, then remembered how often I'd found myself in this dream. Do you mean when I wake up? He nodded. Then why didn't I wake up this time? I stopped your dream. I started. Who are you? He brushed that aside. Why do you think you keep having this dream? Are you afraid of concrete barriers or of crashing? Both, actually, I said, reminded of the last time I'd been stuck in a long stretch of road construction. I had a panic attack. Squishing myself against the door hadn't been far enough away to escape the barrier. Why do you think they bother you so much? I don't know. If I knew, maybe they wouldn't bother me. Why do you keep asking me questions? I shot back. Perhaps it's because I enjoy watching you think, among other reasons, he said lightly. Maybe you're having this dream so often because there's something you need to learn. He walked over to the barrier and opened a small door. I could have sworn it wasn't there a second earlier. Maybe you just need to look at this from another perspective. He gestured for me to follow, then ducked through. I stared at it for a moment. There was no help for it. I couldn't stay here. What if time resumed? I took a deep breath, then walked forward. I emerged on the other side of the barrier. The man stood to one side of the doorway, waiting for me. I turned to look back at my car, but the opening had vanished. Here I could see that the barrier partitioned off a strip of pavement about the width of a lane. Opposite the barrier lay rolling grasslands turned to late summer brown. Other than the freeway, the land seemed void of human incursion. In one direction, the road stretched on and on into the distance. To the other, it curved. This side of the barrier felt like another world entirely. Now what? I asked. Now we observe. He pointed back the way he'd come. Let's walk down a little farther this direction. Once around the curve, we came to a construction worker. Complete with hard hat and reflective vest, he too stood frozen in time. In one hand he held a measuring device, in the other a notebook. His pen had fallen to the ground. Watch, gestured the man. Watch, the strange man said. Time moved forward again. The construction worker reached down to pick up his pen. Suddenly there was a horrific crash as something smashed into the barrier. I shrieked and jumped at least a foot. Brakes squealed, followed by more sounds of collision. The construction worker paled and began running back to his parked pickup truck. I stood petrified. The barrier remained solid. For the first time in my life, I was thankful to be near a concrete barrier. Abruptly, time stopped once more, then rewound, ending with the construction worker again poised in the act of measuring. Wide-eyed, I looked around. All appeared as before, frozen. My pounding heart slowed. I glared at the man shakily. All right, so concrete barriers can be a good thing. If you're on the right side of them, so what? This doesn't help me. I'm not a construction worker. Why is this concrete barrier here? I sighed. To protect the construction workers and to prevent any construction debris from flying into cars. Right? It's a place of safety, just like my law. Your law? I asked, watching him warily, trying to figure out who he was. I remembered he hadn't answered my earlier question. I tensed. Had I been wrong about that smile? My law shows you the way of freedom and acts as a barrier to protect you from the consequences of sin. He continued and flashed that warming smile at me again, as though he could sense my unease. I took a step back. Wait. Who are you? Don't you recognize me? I started a little more, and then it dawned on me. He's Jesus. But why is he here? I mentally cataloged all my recent sins, none too heinous on the list. I had even been attending church regularly. Granted, I often nodded off a bit during the sermon, but I was fully engaged during the rest of the service. I worshipped and such. I was passionate about God. You're Jesus. Yes, he said, his smile still intact. Why are you here? I asked. I felt like a kid caught with her hand in the cookie jar. Because you're stuck, and you asked for help. Because I love you. Thanks. I had yet to feel particularly helped. It was nice that this instance of my nightmare had been resolved, but the fear lurked, waiting to snake its tentacles around my heart in some unseasonable moment. So, you were saying your law? My law is a barrier to create safety so people can walk freely. Wait just a minute. You can't connect freedom and restrictions like that. Don't you know that rules decrease freedom? How in heaven's name could Jesus be so far behind the times? Oh, really, he said. Well, yes, of course, I said, trying to soften my tone. We put people in jail because it restricts their freedom. We fight against oppression because people have the right to be free. So you're saying that more restrictions mean less freedom, that the two are irreversibly proportional. I nodded. Exactly. Jesus quirked an eyebrow at me. Would you be willing to test that theory? Sure. He snapped his fingers and we began to soar into the air. What's going on? I demanded, attempting to keep my voice steady despite the fear coursing through my body. I just lessened your restrictions, he said, his hands clasped behind his head. My teeth started chattering. Even my aggravation wasn't enough to keep me warm this high up. I clenched them. How so? Gravity. It was keeping you down. You're much freer this way. Wait, what about oxygen? Will I get high enough that I can't breathe? Probably. I can't survive without air. In that case, perhaps I will add a small restriction. I'll keep us from going up quite that high. I heaved a sigh of relief. Thank you. You're welcome. Now perhaps we can continue our discussion. I nodded, still shivering. You look cold. Would you like a coat? He asked, and produced one out of thin air. I took it. I had never considered gravity as an asset in getting dressed, but it is. Grappling with the coat caused me to gyrate about wildly. In the end, I only managed to get into it by hanging on to Jesus' proffered arm. He didn't seem to be affected by gravity, or the lack thereof. Thank you, again, I mumbled, thoroughly humbled, or perhaps humiliated by this point. Though, to be fair, he hadn't been cruel or indifferent as he exposed my foolishness. In fact, I had seen compassion on his face. I supposed it was mostly my pride which smarted so badly. So do you feel more free? He asked kindly. Not so far. He began pacing through the air. Perhaps you haven't fully explored your lack of restrictions. Just think of all the things that you can do now that you couldn't before. You can fly anywhere you want. If only I had a method of propulsion, I said. And how would I go anywhere? And then, what would I do when I arrived? Live my life with an anchor tied around my waist? He stopped in front of me. So, would you agree that this particular restriction is not depriving you of your freedom? Yes, I said, hoping that my emphatic reply would convince him to reinstate my personal gravity. Every rule has an exception. Jesus smiled. I can see we need to continue this conversation, but I know you'd be more comfortable on the ground. Let's see. He looked around and we began a slow descent. This looks like an ideal place, he said, as he floated us to the edge of a large pond. The pond seemed virtually untouched by human hands, which is to say that grass and weeds had overgrown everything. A slight breeze ruffled the water's surface, stirring up moist smells of algae and fish. The sky had cleared and the sun reflected blindingly off the murky water. I sank down onto a nearby rock, barely resisting the urge to kiss the solid ground. Jesus settled himself across from me. So what's keeping you from believing that freedom is not the absence of restrictions? Other than the fact that most of the time it isn't? Maybe it was all the pointless restrictions I'd endured simply because they were the whims of authority figures in my life. It isn't ladylike to chew gum. Always wear shoes. Girls shouldn't run. On and on. How many times had someone used "because I said so" as justification for a dumb rule? I don't like people telling me what to do, I said, particularly when I don't know why I ought to obey. It's an emotional objection then, not a cognitive one? Well, it's both. For instance, look at restrictions that dehumanize people. Women and children are sold into slavery, and corrupt officials kill their people for petty reasons. The world's full of brutal examples. How can you say that restrictions don't limit freedom? I can't. I didn't, he said. For a moment his eyes were distant and pained. I suddenly realized that if he was omniscient, he was far more aware of those horrors than I. And if he was all good and loving, then it must cause him unimaginable pain to let them endure. His eyes cleared, and he turned to look at me once more. All restrictions don't increase freedom, any more than all restrictions decrease freedom. He gave me a half smile. I'm not the one arguing for restrictions and freedom in inverse proportions. All right, I need to stop there. Thank you for listening along. We're going to continue with part 2, hopefully tomorrow morning. Thanks for tuning in. Link to Liz's book is in the description. And we will finish this story probably in a couple installments over the next few days. So long.